Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey. I'm joined in the studio tonight by William Duguid. William, how are you this evening?
I'm just fine, thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
We want to delve into today's stories. So, as always, we start with our Ukraine update. It's day 519 of the war. Russia again was struck the port city of Odessa overnight, with the Ukrainian Air Force reporting that 8 Shahed drones and 2 Caliber cruise missiles were fired over Ukraine. The Air Force reported a security guard was killed when a rocket hit the administration building of the port, and the equipment of one of the cargo terminals was damaged. Alexander Kubrakov, Ukraine's Minister for Infrastructure, said that over the past 9 days, 26 port infrastructure facilities and 5 civilian vessels have been damaged and partially destroyed by Russian attacks on Odessa. He also claimed that Russia is restricting shipping near Crimea and the territorial waters of Bulgaria, blocking the movement of ships in the direction of the seaports of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the city of Dnipro in southeastern Ukraine today, and in a meeting with senior officials discussed supplies to the war front and air defenses. Russia imposed authorities in Lysychansk in occupied Luhansk claim a school was destroyed after being attacked by Ukraine with cluster munitions. Vasyl Malyuk, the head of the security service of Ukraine, has his agency was behind the attack on the Crimea bridge blast that happened in October last year. NATO said on Wednesday it was stepping up surveillance of the Black Sea region as it condemned Russia's exit from a deal assuring the safe passage of ships carrying Ukrainian grain. The Kremlin said on Wednesday that just 17 African heads of state would be attending this week's Russia-Africa summit. This is far fewer than at its 2019 conference. So, William, just on that last point about the lack of diplomatic relations between Russia and Africa, what does that kind of tell you about the global reaction to the ongoing Ukraine crisis?
Well, I think the global reaction to the end of the Black Sea deal has been particularly striking, and I think this is what's reflected in the low uptake of places by African countries at the summit. I think it's a big problem that needs to be solved, and obviously Russia may have a strategic interest in making life difficult for Ukrainian shipping, quite apart from anything else. But it is a problem for the world, and I think it's really one of the outstanding things about the current situation that really needs to be resolved. So I think a little bit of hardball from the African delegates isn't a bad thing, but there needs to be much more concentrated action, I think, on solving what's going to become another food crisis, particularly for Africa, but also affecting food prices elsewhere worldwide. And I'd like to see that.
And how would you like to see that done? Do you think that diplomacy is the way forward, or do you think that a more kind of direct approach with Russia is the avenue that should maybe be taken?
That's a really difficult one because I would always favour diplomacy, but sometimes diplomacy doesn't work. But at the same time, a strong arm approach may not work either, and may be counterproductive. We'd be thinking about things like shipping being protected, for example, something that would be both costly and potentially risky in terms of escalating the war. So it isn't an easy one at all. Personally, I would like to uh, be looking towards what China is doing here, and where obviously China will always work in China's interests, but China has interests in Africa as well. And I'm wondering if some pressure might be brought to bear diplomatically there.
That's interesting. That's an interesting take. Because yeah, Russia and China's relationship, and then you look at China and Africa's relationship, you'd hope that there would be some kind of interplay there. So our next story of the night, our very own Lewis McGlynn attended a press conference from Humza Yousaf today, which launched a paper on citizenship in an independent Scotland. So he was saying that Scotland could take a fairer and more welcoming approach to citizenship as an independent nation, according to this new paper published by First Minister Humza Yousaf. Citizenship in an Independent Scotland, the fifth paper in the Building a New Scotland series, sets out who could automatically become a citizen of an independent Scotland, and the pathway for others to qualify for Scottish citizenship, including those with a close and enduring connection to Scotland. Other proposals in the paper include a fairer fee system for citizenship applications based on cost recovery rather than revenue generation, and a commitment to establish an independent migrants commissioner, a key recommendation of the Windrush Lessons Learned review. The First Minister held a roundtable discussion at National Records of Scotland's new Register House, where he discussed the paper with representatives from migration policy organisations and individuals who may be eligible for citizenship under these proposals. First Minister Humza Yousaf said this paper proposes an open and inclusive approach to citizenship, one that welcomes people who want to settle in Scotland rather than putting barriers and excessive fees in the way of families. So we have a quick clip from an interview that we held with Humza Yousaf today. Apologies in advance. We had some technical issues with the video, but you still have the lovely audio. So we will run that clip now.
First Minister, thank you for talking to us today. The proposal you laid out today has much of what we'd expect to see for citizenship on a new and late independent nation. Is there anything about your government's approach to citizenship that sets it apart that you'd like to highlight?
So first and foremost, our approach to people becoming Scottish citizens is far more inclusive, far more welcoming than the current UK approach. And I was really actually interested to hear from a whole group of new Scots that we've gathered here today who are telling us really disheartening stories about how the current UK system puts up barrier after barrier for them becoming UK citizens. What we want in Scotland is a system that is welcoming, that is inclusive, partly because of course it is the right thing to do, I think morally, but secondly it's so important for our economy given the demographic challenges that we undoubtedly face.
And that you mentioned like inclusivity there. There's a lot of that about making sure not only is there people within the country who, on that day of independence, became citizens, but also children and immigrants as well. Was that something that was a high priority for you when devising this?
Absolutely, and also for those that are born outside of Scotland but born to a parent that's a Scottish citizen, that would allow Scottish citizenship to be passed down to their children, and then passed down so it can continue, much like the Irish model. And that allows some kind of enduring link to Scotland, which I hope would then bring people back to Scotland to come here to live, to work, to contribute where they can. So it's a really open model, it's a really inclusive model, and stands in very stark contrast to a regressive UK model that frankly doesn't do anything for us economically, but I would say more importantly morally is reprehensible.
Over the past few years there's been a lot of discussion about the how of independence, so to speak, with regards to obviously referendums and the Supreme Court decisions and such like that. Would you say this is almost like an attempt to shift the question more to less how and more to why independence is so important and so needed?
I think we can obsess endlessly about process, and don't get me wrong, process is an important discussion to have, but look, we are never going to gain our independence unless we ensure support is above 50%. And we have the positive case for independence, we have the winning arguments. That's why, of course, those who oppose independence want to try to shut it down. So what we should do is, instead of obsessing over process, we should be making the positive case for independence, and publishing this latest paper in a series of Building a New Scotland papers as a demonstration of how we intend to continue to advance the positive case for an independent Scotland.
You mentioned that all-important 50% approval. With documents like these, are you hoping to persuade more people that independence is not just sort of far off in the future, but a very attainable, real goal that can be achieved very, realistically?
Absolutely, and it can be. Now, of course, that task is made harder by a UK government that is denying democracy, that is not giving the people of Scotland the opportunity to express their voice in an independence referendum. So they'll continue to deny democracy. So we've got to find a way of exerting as much pressure as we possibly can. And I think that people pressure, that power of the people, is what will break that impasse or that logjam that's been created by the Westminster government. But we only do that if we increase support for independence, and we do that by articulating the positive case for independent Scotland.
Is that a continued opposition from Westminster? Is that a growing concern for you at the moment?
I think it speaks volumes about the fact that the UK government are doing nothing other than trying to shut down our positive case for independence. Where's your positive case? I'd ask those who believe in the union, where's your positive case? If you were so confident in that case, you would be publishing papers, you would be articulating that case for the union. Instead of doing that, they know that we have the winning arguments, and therefore all they're doing is trying to shut it down.
Thank you very much, First Minister.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Lewis for that interview. So, William, on that topic, what do you make of it? Do you think that Yusuf is focusing at the right thing at the right time? Do you think that he is focusing too much on post-independence rather than how to get there? Or do you think that this is a new, fresher take and potentially a good thing for him to have released right now?
Well, he has to do everything in a sense. I mean, one, he has to multitask. You have to set out the vision of what an independent Scotland will be, and that includes how you will deal with citizenship, because it was one of the sticks we were beaten with in 2014, that our nearest and dearest down south would become foreign. And this is the sort of open, welcoming sort of citizenship policy that I think maybe dispels a wee bit of that, particularly with the accent on dual citizenship. Of course, the UK is going to have to, if you like, agree to that, but it allows dual citizenship now for UK citizens with other countries. So it would have to either discriminate horribly, or it would have to rescind the whole thing. So I think that's going to happen, and that's a good thing. There's a lot to commend in this. I like the link, or at least the resemblance to the Irish system, which has worked very well for them. I like the red passport, by the way. That would be nice. And I think also the emphasis on the other aspect of things, which is the common travel area, which means that you can pass back and forth freely, and there's no real worry about people from England coming up to work in Scotland, etc. And I don't see, again, you can say, well, the common travel area has to be agreed with, but you would have to blow away so much of what you've been doing now for 100 years as the UK if you were going to get rid of that. That I think is something that they will have to go along with as well. And I think it's a sensible thing. I do see independence as being a way of getting a better relationship with the rest of the UK, and continuing good relationship with Ireland as much as anything else. You know, it's not like walking away and just dissing them all the time. It is quite important that we still manage to coexist, and that we get on fine with our nearest and dearest in other parts of the UK. And I think it would be the making of the whole island, or set of islands. So a good day today, I think.
So you just mentioned about the relationship between, say, England and Scotland, or Wales, England, Scotland. Do you think that independence would shift the power balance, or do you think that there would still be a little bit of a asymmetrical relationship when it comes to a newly independent Scotland and a newly separate England, I guess?
It's bound to be asymmetrical slightly, because England is a bigger country, and there are various aspects to that we can't get round. But what we can do is make our own decisions without them being constantly questioned or reversed or undermined. And that is important. And I think a more grown-up relationship with England, where we're not constantly under the cosh, where our own citizens feel that it's a place worth living, and don't always think that if it's English it must be better. And there is an aspect of that in much of the unionist opposition that we encounter. For all of that to come about, I think would be a good thing. And I think it would be the making not just of Scotland, but of the rest of the UK.
And on one of Lewis's questions about the how versus the why, what's your opinions on, how Scotland should be independent versus why it should be? Where do you think that focus should be from the SNP?
I think it has to do both, because to get independence, you have to tell your story of what an independent Scotland would be. Before you have any process at all, you have to have that fundamental thing where there is something that people want to buy into. And in a sense, um, getting that on a firmer footing, if you like, helps you with the how, because it is through growing popular support for independence that there will be increasing pressure put on Westminster, who will otherwise say no until the cows come home. Doesn't matter what your process is if you've got 50% support and they still have so much to gain from keeping Scotland, something that is very seldom acknowledged, then you're not going to get anywhere. So I think it's a continuing ramping up, if you like, of the narrative and the positive narrative about being an independent country that will ultimately make any process likely to be more successful. I don't at this stage know what the ultimately successful process will be, but it's something you have to do to get there.
Mm-hmm. You've put it so well, put it very well. So we'll move on now to our next story of the night. New figures have revealed that the growing cost of student debt in England is 3 times higher than in Scotland. The analysis commissioned by the SNP shows that since the Labour Party first introduced university tuition fees in 1998, the cost of student debt has soared. In 2000, the average loan debt for students graduating in England was £2,690, but by 2022, that has increased to £44,730, an increase of over 16 times more debt. In Scotland, where the Scottish Government abolished tuition fees in 2007, the analysis shows that levels of student debt are significantly lower. In 2022, average student debt in Scotland was £29,960 lower than in England, with students graduating university with 67% less debt. The research follows Keir Starmer's U-turn on abolishing tuition fees, which the analysis shows will cost graduates in England an average of £21,000 each in lifetime loan repayments. The University and College Union, the UCU General Secretary Joe Grady, described the move as deeply disappointing, warning Keir Starmer repeatedly pledged to abolish the toxic system of tuition fees and in doing so was elected the leader of the Labour Party. It is deeply disappointing for him to now be reneging on that promise, a move which could condemn millions of future students to a life of debt. The Labour Party, Tories and Lib Dems have been accused of repeatedly breaking their promises on the election on tuition fees, introducing them in 1998, increasing them to £3,000 a year in 2004, tripling them to £9,000 a year in 2010, and then raising them again in 2016 to £9,250 a year. In Scotland, Labour introduced the graduate endowment, which the SNP described as a backdoor tuition fee, and abolished when they first came into government. The analysis shows that a student graduating in 23 to 24 from the same universities and courses as Sir Keir Starmer did in the mid-1980s would leave with £62,000 to £64,000 more debt. While Sir Keir Starmer paid no tuition fees from his time at the universities of Leeds and Oxford, students now pay £9,250 a year. And while the maximum maintenance grants in the mid-1980s was around £5,300 in real terms, there is currently no grant for students from England. Commenting, SNP Education spokesperson Carol Monaghan MP said, Westminster has completely failed young people by forcing them into obscene levels of debt, which the likes of Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak never had to pay when they went to university. It's shocking that having benefited from free education and maintenance grants, Sir Keir is now robbing young people of the same opportunities. In his own Nick Clegg moment, Starmer will burden the average graduate in England with a debt bomb of around £45,000 before they've even started their working lives. It's no wonder young people are finding it impossible to get on the housing ladder or afford a family when they are drowning in debt imposed by the Tories and the pro-Brexit Labour Party. So, William, I have to say this one's particularly close to my heart as I am neck deep in student debt. Do you think that this, the prospect of being hit by a wall of debt potentially until it gets written off when you turn 50. Do you think that this cost will have a knock-on effect on the levels of students going to university, particularly from lower income backgrounds?
It doesn't seem to be doing so far, but I do think it's an iniquitous system that saddles you with the debt. Admittedly, debt you don't have to pay back until you're earning a certain amount, but it kind of imposes a ceiling on your life prospects, so that when you do finally start to get into decent money, suddenly you find you've got this debt, and it has to be repaid. And I would really like the whole system to go back very similarly to the way it was in the 1980s. I benefited from that as well. And I don't see any reason why any government with its salt should not invest in its young people, not just necessarily university students, but all manner of tertiary education, including in that, and I do wish the Scottish Government had the money to do this, the return of maintenance grants, which were a godsend. Often they weren't very much in the 1980s, and you did have a divide between those whose parents could top it up, and you could have a slightly better standard of living, if you like, but you were not saddled with a huge amount of debt at the end, no matter what happened. So yes, I think it's a thing that limits life chances. I really would not wish to be a student with that level of debt round my neck, stepping out into the world right now with all its uncertainties. And my God, there are a lot of uncertainties. If only we could take this one away for starters, that would make life slightly easier.
That's the dream. That is the dream. So, our next story of the night, Shell has reignited outrage among climate activists by handing billions to its shareholders after making profits that campaigners have described as obscene. Protests were held outside the oil company's London headquarters on Thursday after it reported second quarter profits of just over $5 billion, which is £3.9 billion. In the same week that wildfires linked to the climate crisis burned across the Mediterranean. The SNP responded to Shell's profits by calling on the UK government to commit to cut energy bills this winter instead of allowing energy companies to rake in record profits whilst consumers continued to pay sky-high bills. As well as Shell's second quarter profits of $5.6 billion, British Gas have reported that profits have reached an all-time high of more than $585 million for the first half of the year. These figures coincide with the forecast that winter energy bills for households are set to remain at historically high levels, with estimates from Cornwall Insights that consumers are still facing a 90% hike in their bills this winter compared to 2020. This week, the Irish government gave a firm commitment that its forthcoming budget would continue to cut energy bills for businesses and households. In contrast, the UK government removed both the energy price guarantee and the £400 energy bill support scheme on the 30th of June and has given no commitment to supporting households with their energy bills this coming winter. Commenting, SNP Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesperson Alan Brown MP said, "The UK government is sitting on its hands and allowing energy companies to rake in record profits at the very same time that households are paying historically high prices on their energy bills. Wholesale energy prices have fallen significantly, but we know that the broken UK energy market means that bills this winter will stay around 90% higher compared to 2021. Once again, consumers are paying the price because of Westminster control. Instead of withdrawing support from those who need it most, the UK government should follow the example of the Irish government, who have recommitted to energy support for businesses and consumers this upcoming winter. Direct government support was needed last winter, and it will be desperately needed this winter too." So going back to the Shell profits, and when you look at the rise of protest movements like Just Stop Oil, this kind of active resistance and the very public forms of protest, do you think that these kinds of protests, the extreme disruption, do you think that that's going to be the only way that, regular people can even try to combat these massive corporations who are taking in billions every quarter?
It's beginning to look like it, isn't it? And I know there's people try to um, throw a lot of opprobrium at Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and folk like that. But I think actually some of their protests are quite charming. I love these orange jigsaw pieces. So you know. It needn't be something that makes a permanent mess. It's just making your point in a very visual way, and I think that is. I think the general unfairness of how things are is recognised by really just about everybody outside high-ranking Tory circles, and so yeah, I suspect there will be a growing public anger, and it may well be represented in more of these protests, and maybe it is the only way because I see nothing coming from the government to discourage certain people like folk like Shell from making these sort of profits and putting it in the pockets of their shareholders. And also the whole idea of continuing with oil and gas and really encouraging that. To a certain extent, you can say, well, if the government's doing nothing to bring on renewables and take oil and gas out of the game, how can you blame Shell for keeping going and making all this money and scrapping their plans, or at least freezing their plans to move into renewables? So Shell need a wee bit of reining in, but also the government really needs to be taking action if it's serious about climate change. And I know we'll be talking about climate change in a wee minute. That really is the main thing. If the government were doing more, Shell would not be making this sort of profit and just handing it to their shareholders.
So you link me perfectly on to our next story, where the head of the World Meteorological Organization has warned that climate action is not a luxury but a must. The era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said after scientists confirmed July was on track to be the world's hottest month on record. Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning, Guterres said. It is still possible to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 centigrade, which is above pre-industrial levels, and avoid the very worst of climate change, but only with dramatic, immediate climate action. Guterres' comments came after scientists confirmed on Thursday that the past 3 weeks have been the hottest since records began, and July is on track to be the hottest month ever recorded. Global temperatures this month have shattered records, according to the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, and the EU's Copernicus Earth observation program, stoked by the burning of fossil fuels and spurring violent weather. The steady rise in global average temperatures driven by pollution that traps sunlight and acts as a greenhouse around the world has made weather extremes worse. All of this is entirely consistent with predictions and repeated warnings. The only surprise is the speed of the change. Climate change is here, it's terrifying, and it's just the beginning. The era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived, Guterres has said, as he urged politicians to take swift action. The WMO Secretary General Petteri Talas said the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is more urgent than ever before. Climate action is not a luxury, it is a must. Greenhouse gas pollution has driven up the temperatures of deadly heat waves on 3 continents this month, according to a rapid analysis from the World Weather Attribution Network published on Tuesday. The study, which used established methods but had not yet been peer-reviewed, found humanity-made the heat waves in southern Europe, North America, and China 2.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 1 degrees hotter, respectively. So, William, you were talking about the need for this government action, and obviously this has been echoed now on an international level. Do you think that this will push Westminster into pursuing more climate prioritizing policies?
Well, something has to. They're definitely more wedded to oil and gas than they were 12 months ago. And all the nice talk coming out of COP26 really seems to be nowhere, and the oil companies are being encouraged to drill, drill, drill and keep going. To a certain extent, that's reflected worldwide. There is just not enough effort being put into the absolutely radical changes that we need to make. And they need to be planned. They're urgent, but they do need to be planned, and they need to sort of cohere so that it's done on an international basis. And they will require a tremendous amount of investment that I don't see coming from anywhere at the moment. But bear in mind that governments that run their own currencies can print their own money, and that's what's going to happen. Sadly, for some, I think it also means that maybe the era when there was a wealth gap between the absolute poorest and the absolute richest has to disappear, because that sort of investment will kind of entail that. But that's the sort of effort that's needed, and I don't see it coming from anywhere. COP28 is coming up in November in the United Arab Emirates, and they're really going to need to talk Turkey very, very quickly, because what we've seen this summer has been absolutely frightening, unexpected even by the scientists, and we're only just getting to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in one particular month. That's a long way from over a 20-year average, but nevertheless, it's happening far faster than people expected, and the results are horrifying.
It is terrifying. And so we were talking earlier about Just Stop Oil. What do you think that the balance needs to be between, change of individual actions, government actions, and then you see these TNCs, these corporations like Shell? There's obviously going to be a hierarchy of what's most important, but what do you think that the balance needs to be between these three groups when it comes to tackling the climate crisis?
I think it has to be governments taking the corporations in hand and making sure that they behave as they need to do. But you can't just leave it in the hands of individuals. What you can do is incentivize individuals to make the individual changes that are required, but you can't leave them to suffer huge costs because they just don't have the money. Governments do have the money, and if they don't have the money, they can create the money. So it really is down to the governments to drive this whole thing and then make it easy for people to make the changes, make it easy for them to acclimatize to the changes, because they will be considerable. We're still going to have a good life, I hope, but it's not going to be the sort of consumption era that we've been used to for the last 50 years. And we have to get people on board with that. And we need to support, governments need to support people. You can't just leave it to individuals.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree with you more. So our next story of the night, research by the Trussell Trust finds that 36% of young people believe that the UK government is not doing enough to help with the cost of living crisis. This research was published by the Trussell Trust today, and found that 36% of young people believe that the UK government is not doing enough to support the public during this cost of living crisis. This figure increased to almost half, 47%, amongst young people living in households with less than £20,000 gross annual household income. The research also highlighted that young people are acutely aware of the impact of the cost of living crisis on their peers. Of those surveyed, a quarter said that they know someone their age who has gone hungry. Emma Revie, the CEO of the Trussell Trust, said it's shocking that we live in a society where children have to worry about poverty and hunger, but it is the adults in power who should be leading the way by ensuring everyone can afford the essentials for themselves and their family. Commenting, the SNP social justice spokesperson David Linden MP said, "These figures reveal the reality of the cost of living crisis for young people, where countless households have been pushed into poverty as a result of Westminster playing havoc with the economy." The research is also clear that young people lay the blame at the doorstep of the UK government. They are correct in thinking that Westminster can and should do more to support people suffering during the cost of living crisis. The disaster of Westminster policies and economic mismanagement, coupled with the damaging repercussions of hard Brexit, have driven the economy into the ground and exacerbated poverty in communities across Scotland. So it's quite telling the incredibly low levels of trust that the government has, particularly in young people. What, if anything, do you think that the UK government can do to try and win back the, not even support, the faith from the younger generation?
Well, it needs to do a lot more than win faith. It needs to make life easier for people who are struggling. And certainly, yes, dealing with inflation is one of these things. Dealing with energy costs would be another of those things. But also, I think mandating the Bank of England, and this doesn't necessarily go against dealing with inflation, mandating the Bank of England not to keep raising interest rates before we've fully appreciated what the results for individuals is. So there's all that kind of thing. I would like to see a benefit system that actually worked for people instead of being hostile to people, and that when they were in trouble, actually helped them instead of making life worse for them. I would like to see more investment in public services, because there's a lot that's down to failure demand, and it's more expensive to fix the thing than if you avoid it in the first place. And I just think we also need, and this is where we get controversial, a radical redistribution of wealth, because we are absurdly unequal. And that is one of our big problems. We keep talking about we are a rich society, so why are people in this state? We're in this state because we're such an unequal society. And that's absolutely what needs to change. I don't see it coming from the current UK government. And I wish I could tell you I saw it coming from a potential Labour government, but right now I don't.
I mean, Keir Starmer has not been particularly forthcoming when it comes to redistribution of wealth, so I think you might be onto something there. So our next story of the night, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been accused of damaging UK PLC and failing to follow due process amid concern over anonymous briefings that triggered the early hours resignation of NatWest boss Dame Alison Rose. There are reports of a real sense of disquiet that political pressure has led to a midnight exit for such an important banking CEO within the Financial Conduct Authority. These reports were echoed by a Treasury source who described a sense of disbelief and frustration among banking bosses about the government's handling of the row, and by the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who called out bullying attitudes towards Rose. The first woman to run a big UK bank, Rose was forced to quit in a row over the decision to close accounts held by the former UKIP leader Nigel Farage at the exclusive private bank's Coates, a subsidiary of NatWest. In a surprise to city observers, the announcement of her departure came at 1:29 a.m. on Wednesday. NatWest chair Howard Davies had released a statement just before 6 p.m. on Tuesday expressing his support for Rose. However, from about 10 p.m. that night, newspapers began reporting sources close to Number 10 and the Chancellor as saying that the government had serious concerns about her staying in the post. The board was forced to reconvene at 11 p.m. and when it was agreed that Rose had to leave. It is understood that NatWest was in regular communication with the Treasury throughout the discussions and that it was notified of the board's original decision to back Rose before the statement endorsing her was released. There was no pushback from ministers or Treasury officials at that time, they added. The turmoil reverberated on the stock market, with NatWest being the biggest loser on the UK FTSE 100 index on Wednesday, falling by 3.7%. That wiped more than £840 million from its value, including hitting the taxpayers' stake by about £320 million. The change in approach came as a shock to the bank's employees, given Rose's long history of government-backed accolades. She led state reviews on female entrepreneurship and UK energy efficiency, and she was included in the 2022 honours list. However, on Wednesday, Rose was sacked by the government from the Female Entrepreneurship Initiative, known as the Rose Review. So what Rachel Reeves was saying about the bullying attitudes is really interesting in this case. Is that a reading that you would take from this? Do you think that it was a bullish act from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor?
Well, we don't know for sure what happened. It was a very quick change in position. I think Alison Rose had a very high reputation, and as you say, she was the first woman to run a big UK bank. And there's an aspect to that with which I'm very uncomfortable. The fact that she was so ceremoniously got rid of, and so chaotically. I think her days probably were numbered because she did make a very big mistake. It was not in itself the way that Coates dealt with Farage, but the fact that she disclosed confidential information, and that is an absolute no-no in banking circles. But it could have been handled much better and, as I say, less chaotically. And it doesn't look good. It certainly, if there's any idea, I know the government is a 38% shareholder in NatWest following the financial crisis, but it's not really the place of 38% shareholders to have quite such a big stick to beat the board with. The board should be left to get on with running it until the shareholders have a proper meeting and decide whether the board should be re-elected. That's how it should work. And any implication that it's been done any differently, whether it entails bullying or not, if it just entails interference, that's bad enough. So not a good look for UK BLC, that's quite right.
And would you say, obviously, CEO accountability is typically very low. Would you say that the fact that it is a woman CEO, do you think that there would be a gendered aspect to this?
It's certainly possible to conceive of one. I don't know if it's true, but I can't say it isn't on what I've seen.
So we will move on to our next story. Akoba calls for the UK government to bring in new lobbying rules for ex-ministers by the autumn. Rishi Sunak should bring in new fines for ex-ministers who break the rules on lobbying in time for his next reshuffle and tighten restrictions on former civil servants. Eric Pickles, the head of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, the ACOBA, has said. Lord Pickles called on the Cabinet Office to draw up new rules in time for the autumn, the time when Prime Ministers typically shake up their top teams. The ACOBA chief has long been calling for penalties on ex-ministers and top officials who flout restrictions imposed by his committee, which are designed to prevent those from inside information from engaging in lobbying. However, there has been a string of cases where former politicians have ignored its advice with no consequences, leading to Pickles describing his own body as toothless. On Friday, the UK government said it would strengthen the ethics regime to make ministers and senior civil servants sign undertakings that would abide by ACOBA's rules and impose penalties for those who ignore the restrictions. Lord Pickles also called for his committee to have oversight of jobs taken by civil servants who used to work in commercial, procurement or regulatory roles, warning that it is threatening to become the next big lobbying scandal, as utility, water and media companies poach those who used to oversee their sectors in government. ACOBA currently monitors job taken on by the very top tier of civil servants, but departments are left to oversee appointments in the vast majority of cases, often imposing no conditions at all. ACOBA recently reprimanded Boris Johnson for notifying the committee only half an hour before an announcement that he would have a column in the Daily Mail. So it's an interesting one, the fallacy of accountability when it comes to lobbying. Do you agree with the recommendations? Do you think that there needs to be much tighter restrictions on ministers and top tier politicians then going into lobbying?
I think it's necessary, absolutely necessary that that you both do things right and are seen to do things right and not have any insider knowledge guiding what it is you do. So I never thought 20 years ago I would say this, but I agree with Eric Pickles on that. When somebody says that the agency that they're part of is toothless, it's not a criticism of that agency. It's a criticism of the powers they're allowed to use. And I do think that there should be much harder penalties for the most egregious cases. I don't think actually Eric Pickles is that worried about the likes of Boris Johnson writing his Daily Mail column, but there are things like poachers turn gamekeepers, or the other way around, gamekeepers turn poachers, I suppose. particularly with the water companies in England, where Catherine Ross of Thames Water, the interim CEO, was previously head of Ofwat. And what's she doing there so soon? That doesn't sit well with anybody, really. When you look at it, it just looks as if it's all part of the system working against proper regulation. And so I think, yes, harsher penalties for the most egregious cases for sure. Whether it will be done by the autumn, as Eric Pickles wants, and that's, of course, the time of the next likely reshuffle, although you're never quite sure with the Tories when the next reshuffle will be, but autumn is usually a time. Whether they'll manage to get it done by then, I would very much doubt, because as with everything, when it's a gravy train, the wheels grind exceedingly slowly.
And see the UK government wanting to strengthen the ethics regime and make ministers and civil servants sign about their undertakings. Do you think that that's just trying to save face? Do you think it's just good PR? Or do you think that the UK government is actually trying to internally regulate?
I think I'll believe it when I see the actual results, because it's always possible to walk things back, it seems. It's a sort of gilded lifestyle some of these folks live in terms of in terms of accountability. So it's a wait and see from me.
I think it's a wait and see from everybody. So, our next story of the night, Northern Ireland has received €2 million in support of students participating in the Erasmus programme. The funds will be made available to students studying in higher education in Northern Ireland by the Irish government. Students in Scotland are no longer permitted to take part in the world-renowned programme, despite Scotland voting overwhelmingly against Brexit in 2016. The SNP's EU accession spokesperson Alan Smith MP said, "With each passing day, the evidence is clear that independence is the only way that Scotland's young people can once again enjoy the benefits of the European Union. As demonstrated by the Irish government, having access to the European Union and the world's largest single market offers so many incredible learning opportunities for our young people, something that was snatched away from them in 2016. There can be no doubt that for as long as we remain outside of the European Union, Scotland's future generations will suffer." So we talked a little bit earlier about trying to model the Irish form of citizenship, and now it's becoming clear that the Irish integration with the EU and the Erasmus scheme is incredibly positive. Is this another thing that you think we should be following in Ireland's footsteps, maybe rather than following in England's footsteps?
Well, there's not really all that much we can do. It's very much in Ireland's interests to invest in Erasmus for Northern Ireland students, because many of them will end up coming to work in the Republic, and it just works better for them. There's nobody actually in a position to do that for Scotland. We seem to be stuck with the Turing scheme, and only the Turing scheme. It strikes me that, again, with Brexit, it's Scotland that gets the rawest deal of all, because Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, and they've kind of got what they want. They're still effectively part of the single market, and they still have access to the likes of Erasmus. England and Wales voted for Brexit, and they've got what they wanted as well, which is the immensely disappointing Turing scheme. Scotland is the only one that voted against and isn't getting anything like what it wants. And that, to me, is iniquitous. And I think it's one of the things that I would want to see change with independence. I'd like to see us actually mixing with the world again as we would want to, freely and without having to think about schemes and visas, etc. So, yeah, well done, Ireland, and well done, Northern Ireland as well. Keep on clinging to that status as long as you can.
Yes. So our final story of the night, the Scottish Government has agreed increased fees for NHS dentists. The NHS dental teams will receive increased fees under a new payment structure, which will help them provide enhanced NHS care and treatment. This was developed in partnership with the dental sector, and as part of the Oral Health Improvement Plan, the reforms also include an additional £10 million from the Scottish Government to support the delivery of laboratory-based treatment items such as dentures. The updated system will drive greater consideration of patient-specific oral health needs and with more focus on patient-centered care such as preventative periodontal gum disease treatment. For dentists, it will streamline item of service payments by reducing the number of fees from over 700 to 45, cutting bureaucracy and giving them greater authority of the treatment offered. While patients that are required to pay an NHS charge are likely to see an increase in the cost, this will be dependent on overall treatment plan. Around 40% of patients will continue to receive free NHS care and treatment as they did under the previous arrangements. Public Health Minister Jenny Minto said this new NHS offer improves the system for both dental teams and patients and is the first step in the process to make the services available on the NHS reflect the changing oral health needs of the population. It also reaffirms our commitment to the sector and to all NHS patients in Scotland. We are confident that the modernised system with increased clinical freedom for dentists will provide longer-term sustainability to the sector and encourage dentists to continue to provide NHS care. So, William, under the context of NHS strikes down in England, do you think that this is a positive investment in the NHS from Holyrood?
Well, I think Jenny Minto may have also said it was the first step in a process because, again, NHS dentistry is something I would want to see radically reformed in an independent Scotland to make it far more back to the ideal of the original NHS. Dentistry has always been a poor relation within the NHS with this free of charge at the point of need, not really coming up. In England, NHS dentistry, as far as I can see, has all but collapsed. But the story has not been so good in Scotland either in recent months, and particularly since COVID. And performing NHS dentistry is causing some practices to run at a loss. So there does need to be more money put in and more incentivization actually to do NHS dentistry. Today's thing is good if it keeps NHS dentistry going, but there needs to be much more because one of the aspects of it is that the number of available treatments will go down. That will be tagged as streamlining, but it's considerably down. That is to say, the treatments that will be funded by the NHS. And the other aspect of it is an increase in costs for NHS patients, between 50 and 100% in some cases. Now, it's much less than you would pay for private treatment, but it's still a sizable slug, and it's a disincentive to some people to get dental work done at all. And that is one of the issues that has always existed with having dentistry as an aspect of the NHS for which it's not absolutely free at the point of need. I think it should be. I really do. I would be radical about it because dental health is as important as anything. You can find cancers through dental examinations just as you can find cancers through examinations of other bits of people. So it's very important that we don't lose NHS dentistry in Scotland. So positive that this has happened, but let's see the next step and let's get independence and let's make it more manageable altogether.
Do you think that there's much more that Holyrood will be able to do under the confines of devolution, or do you think that ultimately the best thing for the NHS and specifically for NHS dentistry would be independence?
Absolutely, I believe that, but you would expect me to say that, wouldn't you? As I say, this is just a first step today. The British Dental Association, I don't think, is all that happy even with this. They're already saying it's not enough, and no doubt you'll be hearing that on Reporting Scotland tonight. We need radical reform. We need reform of dentistry in the way that the NHS itself was a reform in 1940, was it 1948? I keep
8,
forgetting
yeah,
the year.
1948.
Thank you. Gosh, I'm so old now. I don't even remember. I wasn't alive then. I should just mention that. But nevertheless, so yeah, radical reform is to me the answer to so much of this. The NHS could be so much more than it is. NHS dentistry could be so much more than it is, and we absolutely must not get into the situation where we see a collapse, as is happening and has been happening for many years in England.
I think radical reform is very much the theme of the night, with the environment and the climate crisis and dentistry and the NHS. So if there's one takeaway tonight from William, it's the need for radical reform. So that's it for this evening. Thank you so much, William, for joining me. You've been a fabulous guest. I hope you've enjoyed your time on the show tonight.
Oh yes, reforming away.
So before I go, I just wanted to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend so heavily on the generosity of you, our supporters and our viewers. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you so much. Our programmes will, of course, always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a very pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and to be able to ensure that we can keep making programmes for you at home to enjoy. So far, we've raised £9,000, but we really need nearly £10,000, but we really need to raise the remaining £20,000 as soon as possible. So if you can, please sign up and donate and support. I'm Saoirse Healey. Thank you for watching and good night.